going to play. All right, you should have hosting capabilities now, Diane. Do you see that?
No.
It still says you are controlling Diane's screen. Give up remote control. Does that help?
No. Maybe it's under this more button.
Stop participants sharing. I don't think I want to do that. Do I want to do that? Stop participants sharing?
I don't think so.
You should have host capabilities, Diane. That's what I have right now. And I do have it recording.
Can you stop the recording, please?
I can't because I gave you.
All right, we're recording.
Okay, hi everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Diane Dressler. I am a senior associate with Community Life Resources and a consultant to the Maryland Department of Disabilities on their housing programs for people with disabilities. Lucienne?
Hi, I'm Lucienne Persley. I'm the legal director at Disability Rights Maryland and a housing attorney, if you're a housing attorney. And we're happy to have you here today.
Great. So what we're going to go ahead and do is do our presentation. We will ask you to put your questions in the chat box. We're going to try some participation activities that we'll use the chat box for and continue to move through the presentation that way. We don't have a break built in, but of course, if you need a break, go ahead and do so. And with that, I will let everybody know that we are going to share a copy of the PowerPoint with everybody after the presentation. We'll send it to you in a couple of days. So I'll let you know that as well. So with
Diane,
that,
there's a question about closed captioning. Can we
closed
turn that
captioning. Okay, let me look into that. And Chelsea left. I don't know. Let me find out from Chelsea and I'll see if we can get that turned on for you. I apologize for not knowing how to do that. Okay, you want to go ahead, Lucienne, and I'll take care of this.
Okay, great. Sure, I'm here. All right, so good morning, everybody. This is, let's see if I can go back here. There's a little bit of delay. Let's see. I'm sorry. Great. Okay, awesome. So today we're going to talk about reasonable accommodations and modifications in housing. This is geared primarily to property managers, but everyone, of course, is welcome. We'll go forward. So this training is made possible by the Maryland Partnership for Affordable Housing, which is a coalition of a whole number of groups, part of state government, and also advocacy organizations who have come together to promote the development and creation of housing for persons with disabilities, all different kinds of disabilities. My organization, Disability Rights Maryland, for those of you who have not heard about us, we are a private nonprofit law firm. We've existed since the 1970s. We are Maryland's federally designated protection and advocacy organization. Sorry, every state has a P&A. Let me see here. We're the one for the state of Maryland. I don't know what happened. I no longer have the ability to change this. We do a whole lot of different things. So we invite you to call us or refer people to us if they need housing, or if they need help with disability related services or legal issues. I'm not moving this down. That's why I'm a little distracted. So I don't know why that's happening. Let me see here. Review options. Okay. It's moving on itself. Sorry, there, I'm back. Okay. All right, so some of the things that we do are to, we protect against abuse and neglect in the state hospital, state facilities like nursing homes and residential treatment centers, state residential centers. We specifically were created to protect the rights of people in facilities, but now do a lot of community work, as well as like special education advocacy, transportation advocacy, voting, Medicaid, some Social Security benefits work, although we don't help people actually get their benefits, et cetera. So our services are free, and we're open to all persons with disabilities. Some of our services do have income limits. Okay. So for today, here's a roadmap for today's training. We're going to talk a little bit about the laws that protect the rights of persons with disabilities and go through them, and so you have an understanding of how they apply. We're going to talk about the types of housing that exist in Maryland that serve people with disabilities. We're going to think through, Diane's going to do some work actually hands-on thinking through reasonable accommodations and modifications. We're going to talk about common barriers and how to address them. And then we're going to do some work applying skills that you've learned to common scenarios. So the first thing I want to do is, you are screen sharing. Okay. All right. So I wanted to do a little pre-test. If you could raise your hand if you agree when we go through these, yes or no. And we're not going to answer them at this point. Hopefully the presentation will give us the answers, but if we have enough time, we'll go through and talk more about this at the end. So the first question is, are all landlords required to provide reasonable accommodations to based on disability? So if you could raise your hand if you think that all landlords must provide those accommodations. I see it's going up, 12. One person changed their mind. All right, I think we're at 17. And how many would say not all landlords, that some are exempted from having to provide reasonable accommodations? All right, I think that number is 17. Okay, all right. All right, if you would put your hands down for number 2. Do reasonable accommodation requests need to be submitted in writing? How many people would say yes? Reasonable accommodation requests must be in writing to be valid, or to create a right for the person to have accommodations. Okay. Yep, I think we're at 20. Okay, if you'd put your hands down. How many people think, sorry, reasonable accommodations do not need to be in writing? They can just be verbal, whatever. Okay, 18. No, one person changed their mind. All right, if you put your hands down, great. Service animals, animals that do work for people. Ooh, it looks like we're getting our closed
I think I
caption.
figured it out. I
Thank
hope
you.
that works.
Perfect. All right. Do service animals need to complete a certification class to be approved? How many people think yes, you must be certified? Okay, I think we're at 10. If you put your hands down, how many people say no, no certification required for a service animal? $19, great. Okay, if you'd put your hands down. Number 4, can someone other than the person with a disability make the reasonable accommodation request? Or how many people say can be someone other than the person with a disability? $22, great, 23. So it's just about half. If you put your hands down, how many people say the reasonable accommodation request must be made by the person with a disability? If you put up your hands. Eight. Okay. All right. Number 5 is there a time frame for when a reasonable accommodation request can be made? 30 days, whatever. How many people say, raise your hand if you think there is a time frame during which the accommodation request must be made? Okay, people fairly certain about that. 3, 5. How many people, if you put your hands down, how many people say no, the reasonable accommodation request can be made at any time? It's coming up quick. Great. 20, 29. Wonderful. More than half. Okay. All right. Number 6 says, does the reasonable accommodation request need to be made to the property manager? How many people say yes, it must be made to the property manager, not the janitor or the maintenance person? Must go to the property manager. Okay. Okay, 20. If you'd put your hands down. How many people say it can be made to anyone, does not need to be the property manager? Okay. 8. Okay. If you'd put your hands down. I think there's only 8 questions. 2 more. Are tenants required to pay for reasonable accommodations to common areas such as laundry rooms and community kitchens? Raise your hand if you think that that's something the tenant pays for. 3. And how many people, if you put your hands down, please, how many people believe that, no, that's something the landlord or the property is always responsible for paying for? 22, 24, 25. Okay, thank you. All right, if you'd put your hands down. Our last question is there a restriction on the kinds of animals that can be emotional support animals? How many people say yes? There is a restriction on that. I think we're at 18, 19. And if you put your hands down, how many people believe there's no restriction? It can be any type of animal. All right, thank you. 15. All right, lovely. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing. Diane, would you share again your?
Sure.
We'll go forward.
Okay, got it?
Yes. Question control.
Oh, I have to approve you again. Hang on.
Yeah. We're getting better at this technology. Slowly, unfortunately. All right, housing and the law. All right, we're going to start with just why is this important? This is probably information you already know. So I'm sure in some, at some level, I'm preaching to the choir, but certainly understanding fair housing laws and how they apply to people with disabilities really addresses the history of segregation and the stereotyping of people with disabilities that has been pervasive in our country for many decades, hundreds of years. Certainly understanding equal access and opportunity that's required by our civil rights laws, helps people with disabilities succeed in obtaining and maintaining housing. There have been many studies which demonstrate that people have a better health and quality of life when they have safe, affordable, decent, accessible housing. And certainly knowing this information helps you be more effective at your job. I added this because I thought this was very interesting in reviewing and preparing for this presentation. I noted some guidance from HUD that is just a year old and certainly part of the last administration's guidance, which said straight out that almost 60% of all fair housing complaints are those involving requests for reasonable accommodations for assistance animals. Wait a minute, are involving requests for reasonable accommodations. There's something that was left out of there. And requests for assistance animals are significantly increasing. So just FYI, Fair Housing Act covers many protected classes. It covers discrimination based on race, based on religion, based on your gender, based on national origin, so many things. And 60% of all the complaints that have been coming into HUD involve people with disabilities and requests for reasonable accommodations. And importantly, HUD charges that when HUD actually investigates and finds there is reasonable cause to believe there's been discrimination, they issue a charge of discrimination. HUD is saying most of those involve the denial of reasonable accommodations to persons who have physical or mental disabilities that are not obvious, that you can't necessarily see or observe. So important to understand the law because this is a significant part of discrimination complaints around the country. So we're going to kind of go through it quickly, but some important terms so that we're all operating under a shared understanding of who we're talking about and what we're talking about. So who is a person with a disability? Under the FHA, which stands for Fair Housing Act, and the Americans with Disabilities, ADA definitions, a person with a disability is any person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities. Has a record of such impairment, so maybe they no longer have that substantial impairment, but they have a record of it, or they're regarded as having such an impairment just because of the way they look or act. So important to know that person does not need to be found to be a person with disabilities by the Social Security Administration. They don't need to be approved for or receiving benefits. They just need to have a medical professional verify that they meet that definition of disability. This can be a social worker, a case manager, if that person has personal knowledge. The Fair Housing Act does exempt from its definition individuals whose sole disability is current addiction to illegal drugs. Reasonable accommodation, you're going to hear us talk about this quite a lot today. A reasonable accommodation is a change in rules, policies, practices, or services to give a person with a disability equal opportunity. In the housing context, we're talking about equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling unit or a common space. Reasonable accommodations can be necessary at all stages of housing, including the application to housing, tenancy, or to prevent eviction, sorry. Okay, so reasonable accommodations in housing. There are some legal requirements. Certainly federal and state laws prohibit discrimination against qualified persons with disabilities. That means just treating someone differently due to the fact that they have a disability. You also can't treat someone less favorably because of their disability, either theirs or a family member. But reasonable accommodations require more. So they require affirmative changes in rules or policies if they are necessary to afford a person with a disability equal opportunity. So for example, we're talking about permitting a change in how the tenant pays rent, to do an automatic withdrawal or to pay later in the month because that's when their Social Security benefits come. We're talking about allowing an applicant to demonstrate their ability to comply with the lease and pay rent in a way that might be non-traditional if they, for example, have been living in a nursing home for quite a while and not having to comply with traditional lease requirements or rent payments. It's important to know there must be a connection or a nexus between the accommodation requested and the person's disability. So it's not that the person with a disability gets the change or the change in the policy solely because of their disability. They must be connected to why. So, you know, if you have someone with mental illness and they're asking for a lowered mailbox or a mailbox maybe in a closer area to their room, to their apartment, there may not be a connection to that. But if someone is using a wheelchair and can't reach a higher mailbox and makes a request for their mailbox to be lowered or switched with someone else's so they can roll up and reach their mailbox, there's a connection, there's a nexus there. Okay. A reasonable modification is a physical alteration to the premises. So for example, grab bars, widening a doorway, lowering countertops, and similarly, there must be that nexus between the disability and the modification requested. So under the Fair Housing Act, generally speaking, the tenant is responsible for making and paying for accessibility modifications. So the Fair Housing Act, it was passed in, I think 1968. It's part of the Civil Rights Act, and it was amended in 1988 to add disability. So it applies to almost all housing. I think we're going to go through that in a couple slides, but because there is no federal money in housing, most housing that's covered by the Fair Housing Act, the tenant is responsible for making and paying for any modifications needed. There's some exceptions there that if the development was already required to have been made accessible under the Fair Housing Act, for example, or if there's federal funding involved, then the development would have to make the modifications. HUD has, the federal regs also talk about the tenant having to restore the premises if modifications are being made, and that the landlord can require money to be put in escrow to make those modifications or undo those modifications. But HUD has said in its guidance that the tenant may be responsible for restoring the apartment when she moves out only if it impacts the marketability of the unit. So something like widening a doorway or putting lever door handles probably are going to have no impact on that and does not need to be restored. Okay, so these are the Fair Housing Act, the Fair Housing laws, most of the major ones protecting persons with disabilities. Federal Fair Housing Act is the first one. Maryland has a similar Fair Housing Act, which is essentially similar but has some important distinctions. Maryland also has an accessibility code, which impacts on persons with disabilities. And then we're going to talk also about Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which covers housing. Covers housing that receives federal funding. And finally, we're going to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is not significantly covering housing, but Title II does cover some housing funded by state or local government. Title III covers places of public accommodation, which would include some things like leasing offices. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the Fair Housing Act was originally enacted as Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, amended in 1988 to prohibit disability discrimination in housing to overcome historic segregation. So it applies to most housing. The Fair Housing Act covers private housing, subsidized housing, including condominiums and housing, homeowners associations. Very frequently, especially when I was a young lawyer, we would be getting cases coming in all the time from condominium and homeowners associations who claimed they were not subject to the Fair Housing Act. They had no idea. The Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in sale, rental, or terms of or conditions of housing based on disability. It prohibits discrimination in application and screening, tenancy or eviction proceedings. And as we've said in previous slides here, it also requires affirmative action to provide opportunity and a minimum level of accessibility. Okay. So the Fair Housing Act does have some exemptions. Some types of housing are not covered by the Fair Housing Act. So single family housing sold or rented without the use of a real estate broker is not covered by the Fair Housing Act. Housing operated by organizations and private clubs that limit occupancy to members is not covered. I will say very often you will see housing that is operated by or sponsored by a church, mostly in Baltimore, in the Baltimore area, you'll see churches, but occasionally you'll see like a nonprofit that runs a senior housing, for example. Rarely, I will say almost never, is that housing limited to only members of that church or organization. So they are typically not exempted from the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act does exempt some of its provisions to seniors 62 and older, 55 and older, if 80% of the units can be rented to seniors 55 and older. So what I mean by that is the Fair Housing Act does permit housing that housing providers to limit its housing to seniors 62 and older, or 80% of all its units to housing seniors 55 and older. If the housing meets certain conditions, it usually has to have been built and created specifically for seniors. It has to be maintained with occupancy for its group that it provides housing for. If they decide to go above that or deviate from that, they lose that exemption. And finally, the Fair Housing Act does not cover owner-occupied buildings with 4 or fewer units, so small housing developments. Okay, so under the Fair Housing Act, as we've said, It is discriminatory or illegal to take the following actions: refuse to sell or rent solely because of someone's disability, tell someone or make that housing unavailable, advertise the housing is available only to people without disabilities. Typically, you see that as, people who can live independently. Independent living requirements is how that mostly plays out. Housing that discriminates in terms, conditions, privileges of sale or rental, for example, requiring a co-signer or a case manager for someone who has perhaps an intellectual disability. Refusing to make reasonable accommodations when specifically requested, refusing to permit reasonable modifications to the unit at the tenant's expense, or not answering requests, or putting unreasonable barriers upon requests, conditioning approval of those requests, coercing, threatening, retaliating against anyone for exercising their fair housing right, or filing a complaint. Reasonable modifications under the Fair Housing Act. So we've already said this once before, but generally, restoration of the unit, if someone has made modifications, is not required. If there are things like widening doorways, installing grab bars, or installing an accessible route to the sidewalk. For example, if someone uses their sliding glass door to their patio to exit their unit and get to the sidewalk because they're using a wheelchair, and their steps at the front entrance, and they install an accessible route to the sidewalk, that would not be required to be restored when the person moved out. Tenants are permitted under the Fair Housing Act to make modifications to common areas. So if a development, for example, has common areas, common kitchens, lobbies, etc., that are not wheelchair accessible, but the tenant needs them to be, the tenant can make changes to that. If a tenant requests to make modifications, the landlord can require approval of the plans. They can request to approve who the contractor will be. They cannot put unreasonable barriers upon who that is, and they cannot require a more expensive modification to be made. The landlord is, under the HUD regs, landlord maintains the modification to a common area once it's installed by the tenant. Modifications, though, that are used exclusively by the tenant are his or her own responsibility. Examples of reasonable modifications, they can be almost anything. These are common ones that we see: a ramp to allow access to the dwelling through an exterior door, grab bars, in the bathroom, levered door handles, specialized alarms for vision or hearing impaired persons, a lowered mailbox for someone using a wheelchair, lowered light switches. So paying for modifications. So, when tenants are required to make and pay for their own modifications, it can sometimes be expensive. There are ways to get those modifications paid for. A primary way is met through Medicaid waivers. Several of Maryland's Medicaid waivers have provisions for paying for certain types of modifications or changes to the apartment if needed for the person to live independently, for example. There are local programs. Baltimore County has something called HAMP for individuals that either receive Section 8 vouchers or others that don't. Baltimore City has a similar program to make modifications for housing choice voucher participants. They have a different program through, I think it's through Johns Hopkins, for seniors 62 and older. CDBG stands for Community Development Block Grant. It's a HUD funding source that comes to local jurisdictions and to the state There are many jurisdictions that set aside CDBG funding for modifications to units. Local charitable organizations will sometimes make modifications for low-income tenants or homeowners. For example, I see something about HOC always encourage landlords to pay for grab bars. Yeah, I'll talk about that in a moment. Local charitable organizations have sometimes will do that. Habitat for Humanity in some areas will do it. DHCD stands for the Department of Housing and Community Development Rehab program. They have an accessibility for seniors program that will pay for modifications. There's actually two programs. There's one that will pay for modifications for non-elderly seniors, and another for seniors. They must be homeowners though. Someone mentioned that HOC in Montgomery County, that's the Housing Opportunities Commission, often encouraged landlords to pay for small modifications. And I think that's probably right. I mean, a lot of, there are many benefits that can come to landlords, but chief among them is that if you have someone with a physical disability and you are offering them an accessible unit, they are likely never to leave, because it is so hard to find an accessible unit that, you know, you have a really reliable source of funding for a very long period of time. And just like a landlord, a good landlord will make modifications and repairs to accommodate a really good tenant to keep them. You know, similarly, many landlords choose to do that. It's not required, but often they do it, and it's often not too expensive if it's a landlord that is regularly doing similar repairs for other tenants. We have negotiated often for a higher repayment, a higher payment rent, I guess, for the landlord, for housing choice voucher holders who have physical disabilities, and the landlord, for example, install something much more expensive, like a ramp or other changes to the bathroom to make it that might be very expensive. So a landlord that has done that could negotiate for a higher rental payment to pay off over time the cost of making those modifications. I just want to mention that the Maryland Department of Disabilities has a home modifications directory with a whole lot more information in it. And here's the link, but we're going to send this this PowerPoint presentation to you, and also the links to many of the resources we talk about. So you'll have that available to you after this webinar. Okay. So again, we're talking about the Fair Housing Act and reasonable accommodations and modifications. So we've talked about accommodations, which are changes to policies, procedures, ways of doing things. And then on the other side, modifications, which are physical changes to the unit. So if a tenant is making a reasonable accommodation request, the cost of that is not on the tenant, even if it does cost the landlord a little bit of money. So this is a sort of a strange way of talking about this, but HUD has opined. HUD guidance says that things like parking spaces, parking signs, or other signs in an apartment complex, restriping of parking lots are reasonable accommodations and not modifications. I know it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but that's the way HUD has defined the differences. Reasonable accommodations must be specifically requested by the tenant. Oftentimes, you know, a tenant would come to us and say, but the landlord knew that I had this need. We always tell our clients or potential clients that they must specifically make a request. It doesn't need to be in writing. It can be verbal, but they should make the request. In fact, many landlords will avoid in making inquiries into someone's disability or disability related needs, because they don't want to give the impression that they're inquiring about something that they are not supposed to be asking about. The person is not required to give up any information about their disability unless there's a specific reason why. For example, the housing is only available to people with disabilities. In that case, the landlord can say, you know, this housing is only available to people with disabilities. Can you prove you qualify for this housing by demonstrating you have a disability? They still can't request, for example, medical reports or what the disability is, but they can request documentation the person does in fact have a disability. Okay. As we said before, with accommodations, they must be necessary to afford equal use or equal opportunity or use of the housing. In those cases, the housing provider must grant the accommodation unless it's an undue financial or administrative. It's actually written as and administrative burden. So what are fundamental alterations and undue burdens? They are things that are case by case. They're not black and white issues. They're determined by looking at the specific circumstances of the situation, both the landlord and the individual. So it must be individualized. If the defense is met, the housing provider must continue to consider alternative accommodations, other ways of meeting the person's needs. So for example, this is a HUD example. You have a tenant using a wheelchair. They can't use the dumpster to dispose of their trash. Why? Most dumpsters have the doors or the sliding panels that are about 4.5 feet high. There are accessible dumpsters now, by the way, but many complexes have dumpsters with a sliding panel, or else you have to lift a door at the very top of the dumpster. Tenant using a wheelchair can't do that. So the tenant requests maintenance come to his or their apartment to collect trash daily. Is that an undue burden for that landlord? Well, it depends. I mean, is this a huge complex that has many maintenance people that are walking the halls daily? Then maybe yes. HUD has said it could be an undue burden for a small operation. Maybe you have 2 small complexes and 1 maintenance man between the 2, and he's only there once or twice a week. But it could be reasonable to do this twice a week and supply inside trash units. So for example, if there's a trash room, maybe there's a set aside small metal trash can with a lid that the tenant can just put their trash in there, for example. Okay, so the Fair Housing Act, we've said there are exemptions to it. If you recall a few slides back, it also does not cover all units. As of March 13th, 1991, that's when the date of first occupancy for the Fair Housing Act was constructed. All developments that were constructed for first occupancy after March 13th, 1991, it sounds weird because it takes a whole long time to develop housing, and it applied to permits and the construction materials prior to March 13th, 1991, but for housing that would start being occupied after March 13th, 1991, they have to have a certain level of accessibility, wheelchair accessibility. We're going to talk about what that is. But which units are covered? Multifamily complexes with 4 or more units in them have to have a degree of wheelchair accessibility. All units in elevator buildings, so if you have a unit in an elevator building, all the units in there must be wheelchair accessible. And ground floor units in buildings that are non-elevator buildings. Okay, so what are we talking about with fair housing accessibility? Oftentimes when you look at a Fair Housing Act accessible unit, you don't know immediately that it is a wheelchair accessible unit. For example, if you go into the bathroom, you will not necessarily see grab bars in there or a shower chair in there. The bathroom walls need to be reinforced for later addition of grab bars. There need to be lowered controls within reach, meaning things like light switches, electrical outlets, faucets in the shower or tub. You need to have usable kitchens and bathrooms, which means that they need to be wide enough for a wheelchair to make either a T-turn or a round turn. There need to be accessible routes. So getting from the outside of the apartment complex, the parking lot, throughout the building, and without stairs or other barriers, there has to be a specific route, at least one route to get someone through all of that area. And also common areas, for example, laundry rooms, management office, trash rooms, lobby bathrooms, it's one accessible entrance, need to be wheelchair accessible with no steps, no other types of barriers. So that's what we're talking about with accessibility. And there is a HUD user that has a design manual with specific the widths and the heights, but we're not going to go into that level of detail here. All right, so now we're going to move on. We've talked a little bit about what the Fair Housing Act covers. The Maryland Fair Housing Act is substantially equivalent to the Federal Fair Housing Act. It does add some additional protected classes, for example, sexual orientation, marital status, gender identity, which are not included under the Fair Housing Act. I will say under the Obama administration, and it looks like now under the Biden administration, HUD is moving to include their in their interpretation of protected class of sex. They're looking at including within that sexual orientation and gender identity. And I think I saw something recently that said the Biden administration was reinstating some of the interpretations that had been removed there. Okay, Maryland Fair Housing Act, similar to the Federal Fair Housing Act, is limited to multifamily housing of 4 or more units, provided there's an owner living on the unit. Some jurisdictions have local ordinances with additional bases of protection and additional organizations or agencies that look at the fair housing enforcement. Maryland complaints can be made to the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights. Complaints must be generally made within 1 year, 6 months for federally subsidized housing. Complaints can also be made to HUD or local human rights commissions. Whether someone wants to make a complaint, to the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights or HUD is, a matter of personal preference. I would say HUD refers a lot of their complaints to this Commission on Civil Rights. I can talk more about that if people have more questions. Okay, another big law that applies to housing for persons with disabilities is called Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. It is a law that was passed in 1973. It's been around for a long time. It's a small part of a very large act that had to do with providing rehabilitation services. It's specifically, Section 504 says, no qualified individual with a disability shall be excluded from, denied the benefits of, subjected to discrimination under any program or activity that receives federal financial assistance. So if they receive federal funding or assistance, they are covered by this law. The regulations are very extensive and detailed. Requirements include the requirement to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified persons with disabilities, requirements for program accessibility, so more than just wheelchair or physical accessibility, looking at the overall program that's provided, meaning things like application, recertification, looking at communication with people who have hearing or vision disabilities or other disabilities that impact on their understanding, has to do with physical modifications and accessibility, very detailed requirements. And there are very detailed requirements for new construction and alterations, so substantial renovation of the property. Who's covered by Section 504 of the Rehab Act? If you recall, it's anybody who receives federal financial funding or assistance. So we're talking about public housing. We're talking about project-based Section 8, where there is, I'm sorry, a subsidy that is attached to the specific unit. We're talking about project-based rental assistance, PBRA. It's also known as HUD Section 8. We're talking about funding that is home funded. Home is a funding source from HUD that provides for lowered rents. We're talking about housing that is operated and owned by the USDA, Department of Agriculture, or the Rural Development Administration, which is part of the USDA. We're talking about Section 202, supportive housing for the elderly. This is not a complete list. The important thing to know is it does not include tenant-based Section 8, so housing choice vouchers, where you can port your vouchers from property to property. It does not include most low-income housing tax developments. There is an important caveat there, and that is unless there's other federal funding in the project, or in Maryland, we now have a requirement that after 2018, new low-income housing tax credit funded communities are required to comply with Section 504 requirements. Okay, so what are those accessibility requirements? This also cover private landlords that have a mortgage with Freddie Mae. No, I don't believe it does cover that. Okay, so Section 504 accessibility requirements require 5% of all the units in the development to be wheelchair accessible, 2% to have it be accessible for persons with hearing and vision impairments. Units must be dispersed throughout the development. Other modifications must be made upon request. So a landlord that receives federal financial participation, if they receive a request for door handles to be changed to levers, switching a refrigerator out for a bottom freezer or a side-by-side for grab bars, those modifications must be made at no charge to the tenant. Accessibility of non-housing facilities, for example, the lobby, the mailbox, the laundry room, all those things must be wheelchair accessible. If the development predates the implementation of Section 504, which is July 11th, 1988, they were built before that. They were not, these modifications did not exist, so they probably did not comply. They're typically do not have to come into compliance unless they are subject to major modifications or rehabilitation, in which case they have to come into compliance. I have a note here saying they may have to make modifications to common areas to allow equal use, and that is if it is not an undue burden and there is a request for that. So say there is steps to the lobby, the landlord has, this development was built before 1988, it was not in compliance because it didn't need to be at the time, but there is a request for them to make a ramp out front. If they have the ability to do so financially, like there's enough money in their reserves. It's not a big cost considering the entire repair budget of the development. They have to come into compliance. Otherwise, the tenant might be able to pay and get it done themselves, or the development may have to provide a different kind of accommodation for the tenant. For example, could they move to another building, get a transfer to another building that has accessibility? Okay. So as we said, a landlord must make modification requests unless they pose undue financial and administrative burdens. So what does that mean? First of all, it means it costs too much, right? Walk-in showers in high-rise buildings that have concrete floors, and it's going to cost $40,000 to install a walk-in shower. In most cases, that is not going to be that is going to be an undue financial burden. It is too much considering the overall revenues of the complex. If it was, I don't know, Trump Towers, perhaps, and their overall revenues were, $300 million a year, perhaps that would be considered to have no undue financial burden there. In existing subsidized housing units covered by Section 504, a request for modifications to create a new UFAS unit if the development already has the required number of UFAS units. So say you get a new tenant, you're already completely in compliance, the new tenant has a physical disability, they move in and say, I need you to build me a completely new UFAS unit. That would be considered pretty much per se an undue financial burden. However, if there were some modifications that could be made to accommodate the tenant, or the tenant could get a transfer to an accessible unit, that would be an alternative accommodation that could be offered. Requests for programmatic changes that are outside the main business of the housing. For example, requests to walk or care for service animals. So perhaps you have a tenant who has an emotional support animal. They, their staff person doesn't show up. Their caretaker doesn't show up till noon. They're asking the maintenance person to walk their dog in the morning. That would be an administrative burden. Most likely, that's not something that the development does as a part of their traditional business services, and that would be outside of that, would not be covered or required. Just as a note, HUD does consider a use of residual receipts to pay for alterations under Section 504. If the property is owned by a housing provider that is not covered by Section 504, then under the Fair Housing Act, she'd still have the right to make alterations at his or her own expense. We've routinely negotiated with landlords to use their reserve funds or residual receipts to pay for alterations or modifications that are needed by tenants. Okay, so you've heard me talk about it several times, this alternative accommodations or interactive processes. So as we've said, if the landlord has to deny a reasonable accommodation because it's an undue financial and administrative burden, the landlord still is required to engage in some sort of negotiation to find a solution, even if the original accommodation cannot be granted. They can't just say we're done. If there's several possible accommodations, the individual's preference should be accommodated unless it poses an undue financial and administrative burden. And that's because HUD has said that the person with a disability has the best information about their own disability and what they need, and that should be respected. The housing provider can suggest alternative accommodations. They can suggest other possibilities. A PHA is a public housing authority, and recipients of federal funding, so those getting federal funds, have a duty that is in the regulations, under the Fair Housing Act, to affirmatively market their units, affirmatively do outreach to people with disabilities, to do analyses of policies and practices, and foster inclusion and eliminate discrimination. You may have heard that under the Trump administration, that those affirmatively furthering requirements had been substantially reduced, and there were attempts to eliminate them, but they are now being re-proposed, and I think will continue to exist. There similarly is this opportunity, this obligation for landlords to engage in negotiation and find a solution for Fair Housing Act covered properties. So those are the ones that do not receive federal funding. It's a little harder to enforce because there are not the strict requirements, and requirements particularly for the landlord to pay for modifications, but it still applies to them as well. Okay, so finally, we're going to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act. As I said, the ADA in itself doesn't specifically really even refer much to housing, but Title II of the ADA, there's 3 titles. The first one Title I applies to employment. Title II covers all activities of state and local governments, regardless of the size or whether they're a recipient of federal funds. So there, we do have several jurisdictions that run their own housing, that own and operate their own housing. For example, City of Rockville, Tacoma Park, I think Laurel, College Park have housing that they run that is affordable housing. Title II of the ADA extends the protections of Section 504 to state and local governments. So they are covered by Section 504 with the associated requirements for accessibility, for substantial rehabilitation, for modifications, for reasonable accommodations, etc. The ADA, as a general matter, requires entities, whether they are state and local governments or private entities, to ensure access to programs and services. So includes things like public housing authorities, PHAs, under Title II, and other types of private housing offices or housing management offices under Title III. And by what I'm talking about when I say ensuring access to programs and services, I'm saying ensuring the ability to make applications, to recertify if that's necessary, to understand the lease, to understand what the breach of lease processes are, all those programs and services, maintenance, requiring communication with tenants. So landlords have the obligation to ensure that all the communication and interaction they have with their tenants is accessible to them, whether their disability is a visual disability, a hearing disability, some sort of cognitive disability, mobility disability, all those things. The ADA requires people with disabilities to have equal opportunity to participate in, receive equal benefits of government goods, services, programs. State and local governments, as I said at the top there, that are covered by Title II are required to build and follow those architectural standards with new construction and alteration of buildings and facilities. Landlords must provide reasonable accommodations and effective communication. And that would apply to both new and existing facilities. Okay. So one thing to say about the ADA, it does extend things like in the development, in a housing development, things that may be open to the public. So things like leasing offices, if there's a swimming pool or a gym, for example, that people can buy memberships to and come in, the ADA would require accessibility and program accessibility for those areas as well. So even if they wouldn't otherwise be covered by the Fair Housing Act. It covers things like services to obtain housing, administrative offices, application process, inspections, recertifications, and similar to the Fair Housing Act and Section 504, accommodations are not required if they would pose a fundamental alteration due to an undue financial and administrative burden. Just briefly, Maryland does have an accessibility code that establishes minimum standards for accessibility in housing. So Maryland has lots of codes. We have an electrical code, for example, a plumbing code, a fire code, and we also have an accessibility code. And it's kind of unusual that among the states, the United States, that Maryland has this accessibility code that requires multifamily units, 4 or more units in a development that undergo rehabilitation to be brought into compliance with its standards. So as we said, the Fair Housing Act covers housing built for first occupancy after 1991. So meaning like housing that was built after March, whatever that was, 13th, 1991, has to be accessible. If housing that was built in 1985 is renovated, it is not under the Fair Housing Act required to come into compliance with accessibility, but under the Maryland Accessibility Code, it would be. So this is enforced by local jurisdictions and code enforcement. There is a provision for tenants and applicants to enforce under certain circumstances. Okay. So these are some awesome pictures that we've been really proud of housing that has been created over the last decade or so that have units that are 811 units, which is housing for individuals with disabilities that require permanent supportive housing. Maryland has a very innovative program and has been awarded several grants, including a demonstration grant in the beginning that demonstrated the need and the ability to create this type of housing. So these are developments all across the state, which have 811 units within them. There are integrated housing that is available to anyone that meets the low-income housing tax credit requirements, but there are units set aside for persons with disabilities. Okay, so just as a recap, we have federally funded units. Those are units that receive federal funding and are covered by Section 504. Examples are public housing, low-income housing tax credits after 2018, particularly HUD 811 project rental assistance, PBRA, project-based rental assistance, USDA units, 202 supportive housing for the elderly, continuum of care funded housing, all receiving federal funds. State and local funded programs, similarly, because they're getting state funding, are brought under Section 504 via Title II of the ADA, things like money follows the person bridge subsidy, Weinberg apartments, community choice homes, local and county programs. And then we have private and market rate units, which are covered by the Fair Housing Act. And again, the accessibility requirements only applying after 1991, but other requirements, for example, the requirements to provide reasonable accommodations or allow modifications at the tenant's expense. We're talking about housing choice vouchers, Section 8 vouchers, and there's a whole number of similar types of vouchers called Fair Share, HOPWA, NED stands for non-elderly disability category 1 and 2. They're mainstream vouchers, family unification vouchers, VASH vouchers, which are for veterans, are private or market rate units. This is HUD. When it negotiated what exactly was federally funded, they wrote that definition to exclude the receipt of housing choice vouchers. So a landlord that accepts a tenant-based, a portable voucher, any of these other vouchers that are on the right here is not deemed to be receiving federal funds. All right, so it is important to know whether the development in question is federally subsidized, because that's how you know whether or not the landlord has the obligations for example, making and paying for modifications. So how do you know if a development is federally subsidized, is receiving federal funding? First of all, you would look for reasonable rents or income-based rents, not always income-based, but also reasonable rents, lower than the market rate. The National Housing Preservation Database attempts to keep a comprehensive list with some success. It's not always 100% accurate. Tenants that are required to recertify or present income information yearly, that's a good indication that the unit is receiving federal subsidies. There are lease addendums to the lease attached to the person's lease, asking the property manager. CDA is the Community Development Administration. It's part of our housing and community development at the state level. Or HUD may be able to inform us, or researching deed restrictions if you are so inclined to research deed restrictions, because typically properties that receive federal subsidies have covenants that run with the land that limit the use of the property to low-income individuals and require the requirements as a condition of continuing to receive funding. Okay, so contrasting market rate and state funded housing. Market rate housing typically has a private owner. There is no requirement to keep rents affordable. Rent can be set wherever the owner likes, and the owner can raise the rent at lease renewal in most places. There is no requirement to renew a lease, and that's in Maryland. That's in Maryland, and other states may have different requirements. Owners may set reasonable requirements for minimum income as a condition of renting. The tenant pays for reasonable modifications, and the owner, must approve them unless it's the undue financial or administrative burden. Owner similarly must make reasonable accommodations. If renovating, the owner must comply with the accessibility requirements of the Maryland Accessibility Code. Maryland does, with this last bullet point here, Maryland has a state law prohibiting most landlords from discriminating based on their source of income. This is a brand new law that was passed a year ago. So if a tenant has a housing choice voucher, they cannot be excluded solely based on the source of their income. Other requirements may apply to them if they apply to other tenants equally, for example, credit or criminal background criteria, but solely having a housing choice voucher, it cannot be a source of denying them housing. This does not apply to buildings with 5 or fewer units of owner occupied or to rented rooms in a dwelling. I think it also does not apply to single family housing that is sold or rented without the use of a real estate agent or broker or any advertising. That would be pretty minimal. Okay. For example, state funded housing typically has this is meaning mostly low-income housing, tax credit or other state funds, elderly service grants, other types of housing that is funded by the state. Home, 811, for example. Private owner, often not a nonprofit with a nonprofit partner. In Maryland, often there's a nonprofit or a nonprofit partner because is very competitive to get that type of housing and state funds. And there are additional points awarded to nonprofit partners or nonprofits looking to operate that housing. It's required that leases be renewed for tenants except for good cause. Rents are typically set based on affordability requirements, not strictly based on income, but on affordability. Some tenant services must be provided within the complex. Maximum income requirements are set at 0 to 60% of area median income. The owner may set reasonable requirements for minimum income. If the tenant does have a voucher, it's based on the tenant paid rent, not the overall income. If the owner receives low-income housing tax credits, they may not refuse to accept housing vouchers. The owner must take steps to ensure that wheelchair accessible units go to persons who need them. That had been a problem in Maryland for many years, that wheelchair accessible units were being created, but were not required to absolutely go to the person who needs them. Many owners, in exchange for state funding, agree to extended affordability periods, so 40 years, 30 years, not unusual. Many owners agree to set units aside for persons with disabilities. Again, this is because they get additional points for doing so, and it's very competitive to get this funding. And as of 2018, owners must pay for the modifications that tenants require. Well, I'm going to switch to Diane to talk about, let me see, give up remote control, to talk about the Maryland service system for persons with disabilities.
Okie doke. I am going to start my video.
There is one question while you're doing that, Diane. It says, if a
Okay,
tenant
sure.
paid for a physical modification in a house due to his or her disability, would it be proper to ask the tenant to fix the alteration before moving out of the house? I think it depends on whether it affects the marketability of the unit. So if it is something that is going to make it more difficult to rent the unit to someone else in the future, then it may be proper to do that. I know, for example, Baltimore City, they, with their program for vouchers, they will also pay to undo the modification when the person moves out. But I think HUD has said if it's something like widening a doorway or adding an extra sidewalk, that it doesn't affect marketability. I hope that you're welcome to ask more questions on that if that wasn't comprehensive enough.
Okay, so I'm going to get started with just a very brief review of the Maryland service system for people with disabilities, just to make sure that folks understand where the services and supports might come from to help a person with a disability get the services they need in their apartment in the community and think through their reasonable accommodation modification needs. So by and large, people with disabilities get their services through their health insurance. Folks get typically either get Medicare, and of course that's for people age 65 and over, or it's also for people who are getting Social Security Disability Income, SSDI. Medicare does not pay for community-based long-term supports and services. It'll pay for healthcare services and services in a facility, but not for community-based home services. Other folks receive Medicaid. Medicaid automatically comes to people who receive SSI, Supplemental Security Income, and also people with low income who have income that is below 138% of the federal poverty level. And Medicaid does fund community-based long-term supports and services for people with disabilities. In Maryland, the Medicaid service system has a number of different waivers and also state plan services. I'm not going to get into the difference between them. If you have questions, certainly put them in the question box. But the important thing to know is that these waivers and state plan services are what pay for the supports and services people need in the community. Now, each program has its own eligibility criteria, financial, as well as perhaps a specific diagnosis or need for assistance. So that they're not, waivers are not available to everybody. You have to qualify based on the specific requirements of that waiver. There are 6 waivers in Maryland that pay for community-based services for adults. There are also other waivers that pay for services for children, but these are the 6 waivers that pay for services for adults. I won't go through each individually, but just know that each one has its own separate set of services that are provided. There is one characteristic of all waivers, and they all come with case management type services, and which is really important because the case manager is a critical person to help somebody think through what their needs are in housing, particularly their needs for accommodations and modifications. These are the state plan services that would be available for a person who qualifies for Medicaid. A difference between waivers and state plan services is that if you have the need for the service and you have Medicaid, you can get the state plan service, but you do have to demonstrate the need. One of the services is personal assistance services, and that might pay for staff to come and go from someone's apartment to help them with bathing and dressing and activities of daily living. Community First Choice is another one that pays for a lot of services for a person, including supports planning, that case management service, and a number of other things that are listed here. As Lucienne mentioned earlier, waivers typically have some funding in there for home modifications, as well as environmental assessment. So someone may not be sure exactly what's going to work for them as a modification, and they could have an occupational therapist come to their home and do an assessment of what their needs are and what the apartment looks like to help them figure out what might best meet their needs so that they can make that modification request that meets their needs. Some of these programs have funds for utility deposits or rent deposits or first month's rent, et cetera. The behavioral health system also has a number of services that a person could access to help them live in the community. And again, key to that is case management, as well as outpatient services, medication management, et cetera. There are also ACT teams, assertive community treatment teams, that might be available to a person if they're having some more intense need for assistance in their home. And then the Maryland Centers for Independent Living, while they are not health insurance funded, they are not Medicare or Medicaid funded, they do receive federal funding to provide assistance to all people with disabilities, regardless of the type of disability, regardless of the person's age, and regardless of the person's income. They provide these 4 core services in the box there on the left to anybody, for free. And those are very important services. There are 7 centers for independent living in Maryland. They each have their own counties that they cover, and those are listed here. Each Center for Independent Living may also offer some additional ancillary services that are not part of those 4 core services. Some of them do provide case management-like services for people who are transitioning to housing in the community. And important in what they do is independent living skills training, so they can help a person with a disability figure out the skills that they need to acquire to be able to live independently and and have their independent life in their apartment. They're a very important part of the service system. So, as I said, those case managers will help people think through reasonable accommodations and modifications that they may need to be successful in their home. Now, reasonable accommodations can be requested throughout the entire leasing process or tenancy process, from the application all the way through eviction, being in front of the judge in court. So reasonable accommodations can be requested at any point in the process. So we thought we'd pause here for a moment to see if you guys can suggest some possible accommodations that someone might request during different parts of this process. So if you would just write in the chat box some possible accommodations that someone may request in the application process, and I'll read them out. Maybe get the chat box up. But just if you could type in the chat box, a possible live-in aid, good one. That's a pretty common one. We'll talk about that specifically. First floor only, that's another good one. Yeah, if someone has a ambulatory challenge, they may need a first floor unit. Assistance with gathering documentation, absolutely. That can be a big challenge. Assistance filling out the application, absolutely. So those are good, good examples of things that someone might need in the application process. How about, let's see, an accommodation someone might need while they're searching for housing. What kind of accommodation might somebody need? Let's say they've got a housing choice voucher, they're searching for housing, they might need an accommodation. Assistance from the agency, they might need transportation. There's another comment here. Okay. Locating a unit. So they might need some help trying to figure out where a unit might be. And we'll go through some of these some more in the training session here. And how about during tenancy? What kind of accommodations might somebody need while they're living in their unit? They've encountered a challenge they didn't realize they were going to have, and they might need an accommodation. So, right, handrails in the bathroom. They may not have thought about that before they moved in. Change to accessibility, like wheelchair access, right. Good. Doorbell with lighting, excellent, right. For a person with a hearing impairment. Very good. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the needs that people might have. I'll get back to my screen. All right, so some of the common barriers that people have in accessing housing when they have a disability are getting or staying on a wait list. Sometimes people don't understand the rules or don't have internet access to be able to get on a wait list, so that can be a barrier. Missing documentation is a big barrier. You know, people need to have a birth certificate, social security card, state issued photo ID to be able to apply for housing. And they often do not have that documentation with them, particularly if they're in a nursing facility or other institution. You know, the birth certificate's not under the mattress. So that's a big challenge for some people. They can't locate bank statements. They can't get transportation to get to the bank. They may not be able to get access to the internet to be able to download their SSI award letter, or they can't get to the local Social Security office. And of course, with COVID, those challenges have just expanded because of closed offices, et cetera. They may have trouble getting to the interview. They can't get transportation to the interview or to search for housing. So that's a barrier. Missing deadlines is a big barrier as well, because sometimes, particularly if people have a cognitive challenge, they may not understand the letter they received. They may not understand that they needed to stay on to notify the housing authority that they had moved. So now they're not getting the letters they need. There are also credit and criminal background challenges that people encounter, and we'll talk about them more specifically. So some of the accommodations somebody can get in the application process, you guys already identified. So assistance with filling out the application would be very helpful. With regard to household members, you guys identified live-in aides, but also someone may have care attendants that come and go, and they may be coming late at night. So that might be something that the property would need to accommodate. Service and emotional support animals are a big deal, and we will talk about them separately. And I want to leave some time for questions when we do talk about them, because typically there are a lot of questions in that area. And we talked about searching for housing, but sometimes people might need more time to search. They might need a change to the payment standard for the housing choice voucher. They may need an additional bedroom, not just for 11A, but for medical equipment. They may have large pieces of medical equipment or numerous pieces of medical equipment that take up a lot of space, and they might need an additional bedroom to be able to store that medical equipment. And then acceptable housing types. We're talking about people sometimes want to use their voucher in shared housing, where they're, maybe they're living in a group home, or maybe they're sharing housing with somebody else, but they're the voucher holder. So there are different accommodations that people may request so that they can use the voucher to meet their specific needs. Here are some examples of accommodations for the application process, such as providing the application in Braille for people with a visual impairment or a large print, providing help to fill out the application, allowing additional time, allowing, particularly during COVID, and property managers have been great about this, allowing applications to be mailed or faxed so that they don't need to be delivered in person, doing interviews over the phone or over Zoom or Skype or something, so that someone doesn't need to travel to the rental office, and allowing a secondary contact person to be listed on the application. This is something that I always recommend to people with disabilities when they're getting on a housing wait list or submitting an application. Include a secondary contact person so that they can also receive notices about when you've come up on the wait list, and so that those problems with missing notices or not understanding communications can be resolved in that way. Now, credit, as we mentioned, can be a barrier to people with disabilities for a number of reasons. People with disabilities may have medical bills that have accumulated that they're having difficulty paying off, and that's affected their credit. They may have lost employment and therefore could not continue to pay their rent. And now they've got an eviction for failure to pay rent, and they've got a poor rental history as well as a credit issue. They may have had a change in cognitive functioning so that they don't understand what's required, particularly perhaps someone with a brain injury may not remember that they had a Visa card that they owed money to. They may not remember that they had an apartment that they were living in. And so they're not able to continue to resolve that or to pay the rent. So those are, some possible reasons why a person may have their credit affected by their disability. So some of the ways to accommodate that might be to consider the person's current payment of bills. They may have a past credit problem, but currently they're doing a good job of paying their bills on time. They're repairing their credit. So that's something that might be considered. Proof of no outstanding debts would be good. The person may now be getting some personal supports through their Medicaid waiver or state plan service to help them pay their rent on time, to help them pay their bills on time, to help them do their budgeting. So that would be an important thing to consider in their credit. And documentation of completion of a credit training program. We've worked with some property management companies that, if someone's credit is marginal, There's a credit training program that they can go through to help them overcome that credit, marginal credit as a barrier. And those are really good solutions to the credit issues that a person may have because of their disability. There are also accommodations in the screening of applications. So allowing extra time to gather documentation. People may need extra time to request a birth certificate because they can't find it. And then they need that birth certificate to get a state issued photo ID. Currently in Maryland, I know it's difficult to get an appointment to get your ID updated or to get an ID. So additional time is going to be needed. Of course, overlooking credit issues based on disability-related medical expenses, as we just talked about, and as well as poor rental history that might have occurred because of those credit issues or other circumstances, and consider circumstances behind criminal background that are directly related to disability. The housing provider can consider the severity of the criminal background, some other factors in mitigating circumstances related to disability. So people can request a reasonable accommodation to overlook their criminal background. And we'll talk about that a little bit more now. So some examples include this. Let's say someone had a criminal background of substance use disorder, as well as a behavioral health issue. So they've completed a drug treatment program. They're not currently abusing substances. So that background can be overlooked. The passage of time, of course, if it's been a number of years since there's been any criminal activity and the activity was related to the person's disability and nothing's happened in the interim, they can request an accommodation to overlook that and say, you know, I'm doing well now. There might be evidence from a healthcare provider that the person is now stable and in treatment. So perhaps someone had a mental health disability, was not engaged in treatment, was not on medication, and had some kind of incident, and now they've received treatment. They are being seen by a therapist, they're on medication, they've taken anger management classes. All of this mitigate the circumstances and can be requested in the accommodation to overlook that criminal background. And then finally, people might be receiving personal supports to help them maintain positive behavior through those waiver programs that we talked about. So, so that can also be considered. Again, the request has to demonstrate that there is a nexus or a connection between the disability and the criminal activity. If there's no connection between the criminal activity and disability, then the accommodation should not be requested or approved. Accommodations must be provided if it would reduce threat or provide equal opportunity for the person to be able to access housing. And of course, there are what we call the two nevers. Federal housing assistance cannot be provided to people who have lifetime sex offense registry requirement or who have been convicted for the production or sale of methamphetamine on federally assisted property. So with criminal background screening, the application may be refused based on criminal history if everyone is asked about such convictions. So you can't just, the housing provider can't just select who they're going to ask about criminal background. It must be universally asked. Subsidized housing providers can only deny applications based on convictions, not on arrest records. We have some guidance from HUD that we will be sending you. We'll send you a couple of different handouts after the webinar is over in a couple of days, including the PowerPoint and this website links to federal guidance on consideration of arrest records and other criminal background considerations. Private non-subsidized housing providers have to evaluate whether their policy on criminal backgrounds has disparate impact on particular groups. And they also have to demonstrate that their screening policy is needed to achieve substantial, legitimate, non-discriminatory interest. So they really need to evaluate their policy to make sure that certain protected classes are not being discriminated against based on that policy. And as I said, denials based on arrest record are just blanket bans of anybody with a criminal background, do not meet the criminal background test with regard to HUD's guidance. So live-in aids. Live-in aids are often requested for a person who needs assistance in their home. And medical documentation of the need for the live-in aid is typically required. A specific aid must pass the background check and meet the same background requirements as other people who live at the property. The aid's income is not included in household income, and their credit cannot be considered in the background check. We have found some housing providers that are looking at the aid's rental history or credit history, but that's not applicable because they're not responsible for the rent. The aid does not have any rights of tenancy. And when we work with case managers and people with disabilities and getting a live-in aid, we need to make sure that they all understand that the aid does not have rights of tenancy. So the person can ask the aid to leave at any time. And if the person's no longer living in their unit, the aid needs to leave the unit. You know, they don't have the right to continue to be in that apartment. The aid is not required to be with the tenant at all times. And you know, this is something that we've needed to help folks understand over time, that sometimes a tenant may have other supportive services during the day and evening that they get through that waiver, but they still need that live-in aid to be with them overnight. Sometimes a person with a disability may need to be assisted to use the toilet in the middle of the night, or they would not be able to safely respond to an emergency, or they would open the door to anybody who rings the doorbell because they have a cognitive challenge and they don't understand the danger of that. So it's not unusual for a person to need a live-in aid during the night, even if that aid does not need to be with them at all times during the day because they've got other supports. I'm seeing some comments here, and Lucy, and you probably can't see them, can you?
I can see it. Well, I think the question about whether the live-in aid has to be more than 8 hours per day, I think the answer to that is no.
No, just the demonstrated need that the aid provides assistance to the person that's necessary. And it's necessary for the aid to live there. And I think the examples I provided about the overnight supports are kind of typical of the things that someone might need when they have a live-in aid.
And the next question was, must you have a Medicaid waiver to obtain a live-in aid?
You do not need to have a Medicaid waiver to obtain a live-in aid. Sometimes people have a family member who is willing to be their live-in aid. Sometimes people can, you know, get a live-in aid through some kind of an agency where, you know, they're allowing the person to live there. Of course, they're living there rent-free, and they're providing supports in lieu of their ability to have that housing, you know, that room and board without having to pay for it. Sometimes people have a college student or someone who will live with them to provide supports for them, and you know, it benefits the college student. They're going to college during the day, and the person has other supports during the day, and they're there to respond and help the person at night. So if a doctor states the live-in aid is necessary for 8 hours, does this qualify for the aid to live with them? The medical documentation needs to substantiate the need for someone to have someone live with them to be healthy and safe. The number of hours is not relevant as much as it is that the medical documentation substantiates the need for someone to live with the person to take care of their health and safety needs.
Yeah.
Okey doke. Oh, I gotta get back on the screen. Hang on a sec, guys. All right, inability to care for oneself in the unit. And Lucienne mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we've encountered some situations where some housing providers have required independent living agreements. So perhaps the housing provider is concerned that the person cannot take care of themselves or the unit. So they are adding an addenda or an emergency contact form that authorizes a family member or a friend to end the lease on behalf of the person, or to remove the person from the unit if there are concerns about how the person is able to care for themselves or able to care for the unit. And that constitutes disparate treatment based on disability. Those agreements are not legal. So any kind of concerns must be an individual inquiry. The lease can be ended if there is a breach of the lease terms only. So if part of the lease terms are that that the unit be free of debris and that there be the trash is removed and the unit be cleanly and there not be vermin, pests, stuff like that, and that's not being accommodated by the person, it's not being taken care of by the person, then the lease could be ended. Limited powers of attorney prepared by the landlord, emergency contact forms, etc., are not legal. All right, here we go with assistance animals. So this is often a big topic with property managers because there are a lot of requests for assistance animals. And so let's get through this. The fair housing definition of an assistance animal is an animal that works, provides assistance, or performs tasks for the benefit of a person with a disability, or provides emotional support that alleviates one or more identified symptoms or effects of a person's disability. So HUD has changed its wording around animals, and they no longer specify service and emotional support animals. They're using the term assistance animals to cover the range of service and support animals. Housing providers are required to accommodate non-residents who have seeing eye dogs, service animals like that. So if someone is visiting the property, visiting another resident, visiting the property management office, those service animals need to be accommodated. The next bullet is a change in HUD guidance. And Lucienne, when did that change come out?
January of 2020.
Okay, so a little more than a year ago. The assistance animal must be an animal commonly kept in households. So unique, unusual animals that people might request, there has to be demonstration of a disability-related therapeutic need for that unusual animal. So common household animals are going to, of course, be cats and dogs, birds, fish, rabbits, hamsters, gerbils, turtles, the stuff your kids want, right? And those are the typical household animals. I think some examples of the unique or unusual animals would be monkeys, llamas, things
Snakes.
like that. What'd you say?
Snakes.
Snakes, yeah. Yeah, I think snakes, there would need to be a demonstration of a disability-related therapeutic need. There are snakes that can alert a person to a seizure before it happens. So that would be an example of if a person says they need a snake, and they can get medical documentation saying there's a therapeutic need for the snake, then that could be accommodated. Assistance animals can go anywhere the tenant can go on the property, including common areas. That's another change that happened a few years ago. It used to be only that service animals could go throughout the property. Now HUD's guidance is that any assistance animal can go anywhere with the tenant. However, the animal must be under the tenant's control at all times. And the tenant must take care of the animal and must make sure that the apartment is clean and taken care of. So those are our requirements. Housing providers can impose reasonable requirements for health and safety, such as that the animal be vaccinated, that the animal be leashed, that the person take care of waste disposal. Requiring that the animal be licensed is not a health and safety reason. So it may be required that in the county that dogs or cats be licensed, but that's not a health and safety issue with the housing provider. Pet deposits and additional fees and renter's insurance are not permitted to be required just for people who have assistance animals. Now, if renter's insurance is required of all people at the property, that's one thing. But if it's only being required because a person has an animal, then that's not okay. And any expenses related to the animal can be a medical deduction from income. So that's going to include, vet bills, vaccinations, leashes, food, kitty litter, obedience classes, you name it. Anything that might pertain to the upkeep of that animal is a medical deduction from income. So I'm going to pause a minute because I want to see if anybody has any questions about assistance animals.
The
Okay.
guidance document from HUD is actually quite good, and we'll make sure you have that as part of your resources. It has a portion of it with a sort of a decision tree with, how to evaluate a need for an animal. And I think there's a question about, can the animal get in the pool?
Good question, Lucienne.
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know. I think I would start looking at the health department rules to see the answer to that.
Because, the housing provider can make sure that health and safety is maintained. I would think also there must be a need for the person to have the animal in the pool. So, but that was a really good question. I don't think we've had that one before.
There was another question. Let's see, I'm sorry.
Emotional support animals. Does the person only need a letter from a mental health professional, or do they need to demonstrate medical physical need? The person will need documentation from a healthcare professional. And that includes a physician, a nurse, a therapist, OT, PT, social worker, case manager, any healthcare professional. So it doesn't just need to be a physician or a nurse. And that healthcare professional has to have sufficient knowledge of the person's disability-related needs to substantiate the need for the accommodation. So they have to know enough about the person to say, yes, they need this emotional support animal to do well. And let's see, are we allowed to ask for one to be removed from the property due to them not being on a leash and the owner not picking up after it? I think I have one more slide here on these emotional support animals or assistance animals. Let me get to that here because it addresses that. There are certain questions that the provider can ask about assistance animals. So one, does the person have a disability? And 2, does the person have a disability-related need for the animal? And of course, that medical documentation is needed to substantiate that need. So the exceptions, and this answers your question. If a specific animal poses a direct threat to others on the premises, the housing provider can ask that that animal be removed. But the accommodation remains in effect. So for example, let's say someone has a dog. The dog keeps getting out of the unit and is not on a leash, and it's chasing other people's dogs, or it has chased people or threatened, barked at people, threatened people, certainly if it's bitten somebody, then the housing provider can ask that that specific animal be removed. However, the person still has that accommodation in effect. So they could get another assistance animal to help them. And of course, again, that animal would need to comply with the rules of the property. Also, if a specific animal would cause significant damage to the property of others that could not be eliminated with a reasonable accommodation, then that animal's presence can be denied. I've tried to think of examples of specific animals that might cause significant damage. I mean, certainly there are dogs that chew up stuff. So, I mean, if the dog is really damaging the apartment itself, or if when it's on the leash, it's damaging things and the person can't control it, that might be it. Certainly an animal that would be, I guess, too heavy or something that might damage the unit. Lucianne, I don't know if you can think of any other specific.
I mean, there's certainly animals that chew, rabbits chewing through electrical cords or something like that.
Right.
I mean, I think that might be a lease violation, right? So they have to have the animal under their control, and they have to ensure that there's no damage. If the damage is not so significant that it's a lease violation, because not everything is a lease violation, then the tenant could be required to pay for the damage and remedy it. Yeah, I think I see hands raised.
Yeah, hand raised, yeah. But I don't see any more questions. We'll keep monitoring the chat box if you have more questions.
Sure.
But I'm going to go ahead and move on. So reasonable accommodations or early termination of a lease. So Maryland has a law that permits a person to end their lease early for medical reasons. So let's say a person is in a lease, they're 6 months into their lease, and they have a change in the medical condition or a newly acquired medical condition, and they need to go to a nursing facility or an assisted living facility or some other place that provides more intensive care that they can't get in their apartment, then they are able to request with a doctor's note, and this needs to be from a doctor licensed to practice in Maryland. It needs to be on the doctor's letterhead or prescription pad, needs to be signed. But if the person has a note from their doctor saying that they need to end their lease early, Maryland law allows that to happen. The landlord can charge 2 months rent to mitigate damage, because they're, now needing to get a new tenant. So they can charge 2 months rent as a fee for early termination. The lease may abrogate the statute by including its own early termination clause. And of course, people could ask for a reasonable accommodation instead. But just to let you know that this law does exist. It's certainly possible that the person has a change in their mobility needs, and their ability to get in and out of their apartment. So that might be another reason why they need to terminate their lease early and go to an accessible unit. Threatening behavior. So there are occasions when tenants engage in threatening behavior to other people at the property or to staff of the property, to the property manager, to maintenance. And that may result in a lease violation and a notice to vacate, termination of the lease. So a tenant can request a reasonable accommodation to have additional time to be able to comply with the lease. So they've gotten a notice to vacate. They realize that this behavior is really presenting a problem. And so they may request some additional time to get back into treatment, to get additional counseling, to take an anger management class, or to get additional support from family, friends, or from their disability provider through their Medicaid waiver or state plan service. So they might now be identifying the need for some more hours of support or some other kinds of support to help them refrain from engaging in threatening behavior. So they could ask for an accommodation to have more time to do that. The individual, and not the type of individual, needs to be posing a threat. So blanket sort of assumptions about people with schizophrenia, for example, or people with particular other disabilities that, all of those people are dangerous or might hit somebody, or those kinds of assumptions cannot be considered. They're insufficient to prove a direct threat to others. It has to be a specific individual threat with evidence that threatening behavior has happened.
Diane, could I just say, it can
Sure.
also take the form of, a change in a policy. For example, if the individual tends to get upset with a property manager and there's just been a lot of conflict with the property manager or maintenance, something like that, we've had reasonable accommodation requests where the individual, the tenant, agrees that someone else will have those interactions, and that has alleviated a lot of the problems. So, having a case manager or parent deal with maintenance requests or paying the rent as a reasonable accommodation has sometimes been successful.
Yeah, we've had those occasions too. So that has helped a lot, actually, for some people. There just happens to be bad chemistry between a couple of people. So that can be mitigated by having someone else do those interactions. Okay. Accommodations can also be requested to prevent eviction. So, of course, a landlord can end a lease if the tenant has breached the lease, but a person may request an accommodation. So, for example, failure to pay rent. There was a situation we dealt with where a person's SSI checks had been delayed for 3 months. Something was going on at Social Security. We really couldn't figure out what it was, but Social Security assured the tenant that their check would be coming soon, in a couple of months. They didn't have the income to pay the rent in the interim. So they requested an accommodation to delay rent payment until those checks came in, and then it would come in a lump sum, and they could pay all the back rent when that happened. So that's one example of an accommodation in failure to pay rent. Failure to maintain utilities. We've had people request additional time to get the funds together to turn those utilities back on, and that has cured that notice to vacate. Unauthorized occupants. There are occasions when someone might have somebody staying in their unit and they they needed that person in their unit for a disability reason and didn't request an accommodation in advance, so didn't realize it. For example, there was someone who needed to have a family member stay with them for several nights a week because they were going early in the morning for a medical treatment that required them to be under anesthesia. And of course, they couldn't drive to the appointment or home from the appointment by themselves because of the anesthesia. So they had the relative lived, a long way away. It was unreasonable for them to get there by 7:30 in the morning to take the person to their appointment. So that relative was staying overnight several times a week. And the property management questioned it, rightfully so. But when the situation was explained and the accommodation was requested, that resolved that issue. So there may be times when somebody needs someone in their unit for a brief period of time for a medical reason. Lease violations can also be for health and safety reasons, damage, criminal activity, hoarding, unsanitary conditions. Of course, people can request additional time to get services to help them with hoarding or with cleaning their unit. It may not be identified that that's a big problem until that notice to vacate comes. So they may request additional time to get services in for that. And of course, threatening behavior, and we've just talked about that at length. So someone wants to make a reasonable accommodation request. When do they do it? Who does it? How do they do it? How do they describe what they need? How do they link disability to the request they're making? And what types of information do they need to include? So the when, as we've said, requests can be made at any time, all the way from the application process through the eviction process. So there is no time frame. The request can be made by anybody or to anybody who is employed by the housing provider. The request does not need to be made only to the property manager or to a specific staff person at a housing authority. It can be made to anybody employed by the housing provider. That includes, of course, the property manager, but the maintenance staff, maybe it's the admin at the housing authority or somebody else at the housing authority. So anybody, the cleaning staff, anybody at that housing provider can receive a reasonable accommodation request. And we usually recommend, of course, that the property management companies direct their staff to have them report those requests on where they need to go. The request can be made by the person with a disability, but they can also be made by their healthcare provider, so any of those healthcare providers we mentioned, and by family and friends. So the request does not need to come just from the person with a disability. The request can be verbal. The request cannot be required to be in writing. Now, we always recommend that it's best to have them in writing. We always recommend that people, write out their request, be specific about what they need, to state in their request that they have a disability, and what the accommodation is required and how that meets their disability-related needs. What is that nexus and how is that going to help them with their disability-related needs? So we always recommend it be in writing, but it can't be required to be in writing, and it can't be denied if it's not in writing. And the housing provider can't require the request to be made on a specific form. So if a person's writing a letter and they've given you a letter requesting an accommodation, you can't say, well, now you have to fill out my form. That's not allowed. When you get the request as a housing provider, you can request documentation from a healthcare professional that the accommodation is needed due to the disability unless that need is obvious. So let's say someone comes and is applying for an apartment. They are visually impaired. They have a seeing eye dog. it's obvious that they're going to need an accommodation for an assistance animal in their home. Or someone may be using a wheelchair and they, the apartment they're renting, there are steps to get down to the front door, but they have a sliding glass door that maybe they could have a ramp or a sidewalk from the main sidewalk down to their sliding glass door. So the need for that is obvious. They can't do the steps with the wheelchair, so the need for that would be obvious. But in other cases, documentation can be requested. And as I've already stated, the healthcare professional is someone who has sufficient knowledge of the disability-related needs to confirm the need for the accommodation. And that's physician, social worker, OT/PT, nurse, case manager, therapist, any of the above. A specific form for medical documentation also cannot be required. So if a person gives you a letter from their case manager stating that they need an assistance animal, then that's sufficient documentation as long as it explains that the person has a disability and that they need this assistance animal for the disability-related needs. And the person, of course, cannot be required to disclose anything specific about their disability or to provide any kind of medical history or medical records to prove that they need the accommodation. So what happens once the request is received? Well, the housing provider considers the request and needs to respond in a timely manner. Now, HUD has said that 10 days is considered best practice. Certainly delaying for a month or two would be considered an extensive delay, and that HUD has said can be considered a denial by default. So if the response is not given in a timely manner, it's been a while, then it can be considered a denial. A written response from the housing provider is recommended, although not required. But again, just as we encourage people making the requests in writing, we encourage housing providers to make the response in writing. If the request is approved, the response should provide a time frame for providing the accommodation. So let's say someone's asking for a grab bar and it's been approved. So the housing provider should say, we will install that grab bar within the next 2 weeks, or whatever the time frame is to get that work done, given the maintenance schedule. The housing provider can propose an alternative strategy for providing the accommodation. So perhaps I'll use the trash example again. So perhaps a person has said, I can't use the dumpster. Can you please have the maintenance come and pick up my trash twice a week? I'll leave it outside the door. Well, the housing provider might say, we'd prefer not to do that, but we can put a separate receptacle by the dumpster that you can reach, that you're able to use. And we would like you to put your trash in there. So that's an alternative suggestion. And if the person's able to do that, then that might be, that interactive process to have that accommodation met through different means. Let's see. If the request is denied, the housing provider must give a reason for the denial. So I remember a situation where a person with autism had requested a top floor apartment because the noise from people above them triggered some of their difficulties. And the top floor apartment, it was with a voucher, but the top floor apartment that they could find was above the payment standard. So they requested to have their rent be approved to be slightly above the payment standard. And the response from the housing authority was in writing, and it said, your request is denied. That was it. So a reason needs to be given for the denial. You can't just say no. And again, the housing provider needs to engage in a dialogue. So if you need to say no, is there some other strategy? Is there some other way that request can be accommodated? something else that can be done. And if the denial is due to financial burden, the housing provider needs to explore, if it's for a modification, when can the work be done? So maybe right now the housing provider is not able to financially do it, but they might be able to do part of the work now, part of the work later. Or the person requesting the modification might be able to bring some funds to the table along with the housing providers to make that modification affordable. They may have some waiver funds that help pay for a modification. And if it's a financial burden for the housing provider to do it, then again, that person with a disability might be able to bring some resources to the table. So let's see, we have a comment or two, I think.
Yeah. I will say, Diane, as well, the Section 8 regulations allow for exceptions if needed, exception rents if needed as a reasonable accommodation to someone's disability. So that if a tenant, for example, needed the higher floor unit, and it could be documented that that was required to accommodate their disability, the PHA, the Section 8 office, might need to approve a higher rent.
Right.
There was
and typically 20% above the payment standard is kind of, typically approved. Up to 20% above the payment standard. Requests for going above 20% above the payment standard might need further approval from HUD, but that's a typical thing with housing authorities. So the question
was, if a family member requests an accommodation and the resident doesn't want the accommodation, what should management do to handle the request? Or should we document in the file or ask the resident to write a note to be placed in the file? I don't know that it's stated anywhere what the actual answer is. Certainly you should listen to the resident. The resident gets to make that final determination. I guess unless they're under guardianship or something like that, but assuming you have a resident that can make that decision. I personally would recommend, if I were advising a housing manager, and you might want to consult your own lawyer as well, just to write the resident a letter just to document that the resident told you that they didn't want it. And you may just want to say, let me know if you change your mind or if there's another way we can accommodate you. Could be handled several different ways, but I think that the main thing is that the resident gets to decide what best meets their needs.
Right. Is that the only question? No, we've got another one.
Let's see. I think there is. Reasonable accommodations at our company are all handled at the corporate level. Therefore, we have a request form that the resident completes for reasonable accommodations. The site are sent to this. This is the way we have the accommodation request. The HUD guidance says straight out that you cannot require the use of a specific form. So, you are incurring some liability. I realize it's on the corporate, the corporation has made this determination, but I think if someone were to make a complaint, HUD would stand by their guidance, which is if someone is giving you a reasonable accommodation request. Yeah.
Any other? Okay, so I think we have reached the end of our presentation. Are there any other questions at all from anybody? Just give a minute for folks in case they want to type something in. Okay. A landlord can charge up to 2 months rent if someone vacates due to medical. Yeah, under that Maryland law. a landlord can charge up to 2 months rent if someone exits their lease due to medical reasons. So the landlord needs to allow them to get out of their lease obligation, but again, they can charge that 2 months rent. Now there may be some lease provision that abrogates that. So you would need to take a look at the lease specifically to make sure that that doesn't, that's not there.
So this is even with a voucher. Yes, I will say common law still applies, which is that the landlord has a duty to mitigate. So if the landlord can fill the unit, that they cannot charge the 2 months rent. That would be unlawful enrichment of themselves. But this is where I have a big problem with that law, because I think the Fair Housing Act, which is federal law, controls here. And the Fair Housing Act says that reasonable accommodations must be granted unless an undue financial or administrative burden. And it may not be a burden for the landlord to let the person out of their lease earlier and or without the 2 months market rent. So that's why I often request just a reasonable accommodation of early termination under the Fair Housing Act, because I think that's more supportable under the law. And if it went to court, I think that's where the courts would come down. I will say that early termination law could conceivably be broader than the Fair Housing Act, in that you don't necessarily need to be a person with a disability. So for example, if you were in a car accident and broke your back and were expected to recover within 6 months, you may not necessarily be a person with a disability under the law because it's a short-term disability. But you may well need to be able to move to a place within that 6 months that meets your needs. So in some ways that early termination law is broader than the regular Fair Housing Act. But yes, it's a huge problem for people with vouchers, absolutely.
There's a question about when will we receive the PowerPoint presentation. We actually have 3 things we're going to send you. We'll send you the PowerPoint presentation. We will send you the links to the HUD guidance on criminal records, and there's some other guidance in that document. It's a Word document with those links that we'll send you. And then we also have a handout that's called What Law Applies, and it's a sort of easy to access guidance to help people know whether it's Fair Housing Act, 504, ADA, that applies to a particular apartment, a particular development. So we'll give you the What Law Applies handout as well. And you will receive them, if I can get them all put together, probably tomorrow. Yeah, probably tomorrow. It'll be through Constant Contact, so it'll be an email, and the attachments will be there. You'll be able to click on them and download them.
There was a question about can a landlord charge for damages that have occurred due to a service animal? And I think clearly, yes, they can. Should we go through the pre-test, post-test questions real quick?
Sure.
Okay, let me see if I can.
We'll just go through and give the answers.
All right, awesome. We'll just do this. Are landlords required to provide reasonable accommodations based on disability, or all landlords, sorry. So hands again, if you would, for are all landlords, what do you think? Yes, all landlords are required. How many say yes? Yeah, 11, okay. And how many for no? Okay, so I think the answer to that is no. there are landlords that are exempted from the Fair Housing Act in Section 504, and those are the landlords we talked about that, for example, are single-family dwellings sold without the use of a broker or advertising, 4 or fewer units with a owner-occupied unit, or units that are closed to only membership for people in certain groups, for example, are not required to cover, are not covered by the Fair Housing Act. Okay. The next question is, do reasonable accommodation requests need to be submitted in writing? How many say yes? They need to be in writing. 7, and how many say nope? They can be submitted other ways. Verbally, for example, or phone call. Okay, I think we're at 17. Yeah, I think that's the second is true, that they can be made verbally, and they do not need to be in writing. Number 3, do service animals need to complete a certification course to be approved? And by service animals, we're talking about animals that do work for people, like a seeing eye dog, a psychiatric service dog, for example. How many people say, yes, they need to present a certification, have gone through certification?
Yeah, I don't think we covered this in the
I don't know
presentation.
if we did.
We didn't. So I'll go ahead and address that real quickly. While a seeing eye dog may need to be certified for the person with a disability, to ensure that that dog knows what to do for it, that certification is not required for it to be approved by the housing provider. So the housing provider cannot require that certification of a service animal be provided for that accommodation to be approved. Lucienne, I think you froze. Lucienne, you froze. Of course, she can't hear me. Tell her that. All right, well, I'm going to go through the rest of these questions because okie doke, here, I've got the questions. Can someone other than the person with a disability make a reasonable accommodation request? I'm just going to go ahead and answer them. The answer to that is yes. Family member, case manager, healthcare professional, somebody else can make the request on behalf of the person with a disability. Question number 5, is there a time frame for when a reasonable accommodation request can be made? And the answer to that is no. An accommodation request can be made at any point in the process. Number 6, does a reasonable accommodation request need to be made to the property manager? And the answer to that one is no. It does not need to be made to the property manager. That request can be made to anybody employed by the landlord. So again, training your other staff to process those requests that they may receive is important to do. Lucienne, I just went ahead and I'm reading it.
Yeah, thank you. I got
Sure.
kicked off for a moment.
Yeah, I saw. You froze.
I know. All right.
Yeah.
Number
So there's
7.
just-
are-
Okay.
Number
Tenants-
7, are tenants required to pay for reasonable modifications to common areas such as laundry rooms and community kitchens? Lucienne, you want to answer that?
They can be. They can't. I guess they're not required, but if they wish for them to be made be made accessible, and it's not otherwise required of the landlord, the tenant, it would be on the tenant to pay if the tenant wanted them to be made accessible. The landlord would have to maintain the common area accessibility modifications thereafter, though.
And then the final question, is there a restriction on the kinds of animals that can be emotional support animals?
And the strict answer to that is no. However, for animals that are unique or unusual, there is a higher threshold now, and that is new guidance from HUD as of 2020, saying that if the tenant wants an unusual type of animal, they must show that there is a therapeutic need and provide medical documentation of that.
Also, one other thing that we didn't mention with assistance animals is that breed restrictions on assistance animals do not apply. So the property may have a restriction on certain kinds of dogs, pit bulls, whatnot, but those breed restrictions do not apply to assistance animals. So I'm just looking to see if there are any other questions. And I don't see anything. So I'm just going to say thank you all for your participation today. Again, we will send these materials to you. Our contact information is the last slide, which right here I will get to. So if you have questions, please feel free to contact us. And again, thank you for your participation. Go enjoy this gorgeous day.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucienne.
Sure. Thanks, Diane.